The shadows in Jerusalem that Thursday night fell differently. They were not the ordinary shadows of evening descending upon ancient stone, though those shadows came as they always did. They were not the shadows cast by the thousands of oil lamps being lit across the city for Passover, though those flames flickered in every window from the lower city to the wealthy quarters near the Temple Mount. These were shadows of a different nature, shadows that seemed to carry weight, shadows that moved with purpose through narrow streets and gathered in hidden courtyards where men spoke in whispers about a problem that had to be solved before the sun rose again. The year is 33 Anno Domini, the hour is approaching midnight, and inside the most powerful house in all of Jerusalem, in the private residence of the high priest Caiaphas, a council is convening that will change the course of human history forever. What you are about to witness is not simply a religious gathering or a political meeting. It is the moment when earthly power and heavenly purpose collided with such force that the shockwave is still being felt 2,000 years later. To understand what happened inside that house on that Thursday night, you need to understand first who Caiaphas was and why his residence had become the nerve center of a conspiracy that had been building for months. Joseph Caiaphas was not just any religious leader. He was the 18th high priest of Israel under Roman occupation, appointed to his position around the year 18 AD by the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus, and he had managed to keep that position for nearly 2 decades through a combination of political cunning, religious authority, and a willingness to collaborate with Rome when necessary. His very survival in a position where high priests were frequently removed and replaced was a testament to his ability to navigate the treacherous waters between Jewish tradition and Roman power. He was married to the daughter of Annas, the former high priest, who still wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, and this family connection gave Caiaphas access to networks of power that extended from the temple treasury to the corridors of the Roman praetorium. The house of Caiaphas was located in the upper city of Jerusalem, the wealthy neighborhood on the western hill where the priestly aristocracy, the Sadducees, and the richest merchants built their limestone mansions with Roman-style courtyards, imported marble columns, and sophisticated water systems fed by private cisterns. Archaeological excavations in this area have revealed homes with ritual baths, ornate mosaic floors, and frescoed walls that speak to the wealth concentrated in this part of the city. Caiaphas' house would have been among the grandest, befitting a man who controlled not only the religious life of the nation, but also the enormous economic engine of the temple, with its daily sacrifices, its money-changing operations, and its trade in animals for offerings. From the roof of his house, Caiaphas could look down upon the temple itself, gleaming white and gold on Mount Moriah, the center of Jewish worship and the source of his authority. But on this Thursday night, as the city settled into the Passover meal that every Jewish family was required to observe, Caiaphas was not at rest. He had not been at rest for weeks, perhaps months, as reports kept coming to him about a rabbi from Galilee who was attracting crowds, performing signs that people were calling miracles, and speaking with an authority that threatened everything the high priest had built. The problem was not simply that Jesus of Nazareth was popular. Popular rabbis came and went. The problem was what he was saying and what people were beginning to believe about him. He spoke of a kingdom. He accepted the title of Messiah. He had entered Jerusalem just days before riding on a donkey, while crowds threw down their cloaks and waved palm branches and shouted words from Psalm 118 that everyone recognized as messianic prophecy. And most dangerous of all, he had walked into the temple, the sacred space that Caiaphas controlled, and had overturned the tables of the money changers and driven out those who sold animals for sacrifice, calling the temple a house of prayer that they had turned into a den of robbers. That action in the temple had been the final straw. It was not just an insult to the high priest's authority. It was a direct challenge to the economic and political order that kept the peace with Rome. The temple operated by permission of the Roman governor. The high priest served at the pleasure of that governor. Any disruption, any hint of messianic fervor, that could lead to riots or rebellion, would bring down Roman wrath not just on Jesus, but on the entire Jewish leadership. Caiaphas understood this better than anyone. He had seen what Rome did to troublemakers. He had watched as the legions crucified rebels and burned villages and slaughtered thousands when order was threatened. His job, as he understood it, was to maintain stability, to keep the Jewish people safe by keeping them obedient to Rome, and to preserve the temple and its worship, even if it meant making compromises that more zealous Jews would never accept. So the meeting that was taking place in his house this Thursday night was not happening by chance. It had been planned. Messengers had been sent. The key members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of 71 men who governed Jewish religious and civil life, had been summoned. Not all 71, you understand, because a meeting of the full Sanhedrin required proper notice and had to follow specific procedures. This was something different. This was an informal gathering, a strategy session, a chance for the inner circle to decide what had to be done and how to do it quickly. The official trial, if you could call it that, would come later. But the decision was being made now, in the courtyard and reception halls of Caiaphas' house, as men in expensive robes arrived one by one through the darkness, glancing over their shoulders to make sure they were not being followed. Who were these men who gathered in the house of Caiaphas that night? They were the power elite of Jerusalem, the ones who had the most to lose if the Romans decided that the Jewish leadership could not maintain control. There were other chief priests, members of the priestly families who took turns serving in the temple and who shared in its revenues. There were elders, the respected laymen who represented the aristocratic families of Judea and who owned land and conducted business and paid taxes to Rome. And there were scribes, the experts in Jewish law who could cite every detail of Torah and tradition, and who served as lawyers, judges, and advisors. Most of these men were Sadducees, the religious party that controlled the temple and collaborated with Rome. Unlike the Pharisees, who were more popular with the common people and who believed in resurrection and angels and oral tradition, the Sadducees accepted only the written Torah, denied the resurrection, and focused on maintaining their power in this world rather than hoping for the next. The atmosphere in the house as these men gathered must have been tense, electric with urgency and fear. They knew that Jesus was somewhere in the city. They knew that he had celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples. They had tried to arrest him before, but always during the day, in public, and they had hesitated because he was surrounded by crowds, and any attempt to seize him could spark a riot. But if they could find him at night, away from the crowds, in a place where he could be taken quietly, then everything could be done before the people even knew what had happened. By the time the sun rose, it would be too late for his followers to do anything. The problem was finding him. Jerusalem was crowded with Passover pilgrims. The city was a maze of streets and courtyards and rented rooms. Jesus could be anywhere. And then, as if in answer to the high priest's desperate need, an opportunity presented itself. One of Jesus' own disciples, a man named Judas Iscariot, had come to the chief priests days before with an offer. He would betray Jesus. He would lead them to a place where Jesus could be arrested quietly, away from the crowds. And he would do it for money. 30 silver coins, the price of a slave. The Gospel accounts tell us that Satan had entered into Judas, that this betrayal was not just human treachery, but a cosmic battle between light and darkness. But from the perspective of Caiaphas and his council, Judas was simply a useful tool, an insider who had become disillusioned or greedy or both, and who was willing to solve their problem for them. They had agreed to pay him. They had told him to watch for his chance. And on this Thursday night, word had come. Judas knew where Jesus would be. He would lead them there. All Caiaphas had to do was provide the men to make the arrest. But here is where the situation became complicated. Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin had authority over Jewish religious law, but they did not have the authority to execute anyone. That power belonged to Rome alone. The Romans did not allow their subject peoples to carry out capital punishment, because that was a symbol of sovereignty, and Rome tolerated no sovereignty but its own. So if Caiaphas wanted Jesus dead, and he did, he would need to present the case in a way that would convince the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to issue the execution order. That meant the charge could not simply be a religious one, like blasphemy, which the Romans would not care about. It had to be a political charge, something that threatened Roman interests. They would have to present Jesus as a rebel, a would-be king, a man who was inciting the people to overthrow Caesar. And to do that, they would need a trial, or at least the appearance of one, to establish the facts and to give Pilate legal cover for the execution. As the council waited in the house, servants moved through the rooms, lighting more lamps, bringing wine and water, preparing the spaces where the interrogation would take place. The main courtyard would have been the center of activity, an open space surrounded by columns and rooms where people could gather. There would have been a large upper room where Caiaphas could preside, where witnesses could be heard, where the questioning could take place with at least some semblance of legal formality. And there would have been lower rooms, storage areas, servants' quarters, places where a prisoner could be held, where guards could wait. Archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem have uncovered what some believe to be the actual house of Caiaphas, a complex structure with courtyards, a large upper room, and a deep pit or dungeon carved into the rock below, where prisoners could be lowered and held in darkness. Whether or not that specific site is authentic, it gives us a sense of what such a residence would have been like, the layers of public and private space, the mixture of luxury and function, the architectural statement of power. The men in the council that night were not monsters. They were not cackling villains plotting evil for its own sake. They were, in their own minds, responsible leaders making a difficult decision to protect their people. This is important to understand. Caiaphas genuinely believed that if Jesus was allowed to continue, if the messianic movement around him grew, Rome would intervene with overwhelming force. He said as much earlier, according to the Gospel of John, when he told the council, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." John adds a remarkable commentary here, noting that Caiaphas did not say this on his own authority, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. In other words, Caiaphas spoke a truth far deeper than he understood. He thought he was making a cold political calculation. He did not know that he was announcing the gospel itself, the substitutionary death of one man for many, the gathering of all nations into one people through the cross. But on that Thursday night, such theology was the farthest thing from anyone's mind. The focus was on action. Where was Judas? When would he arrive? How many guards would be needed? The temple had its own police force, a contingent of Levites who maintained order in the sacred precincts and who could be commanded by the chief priests. Caiaphas sent some of these temple guards, along with servants from the high priestly household, to accompany Judas. And to make sure the arrest went smoothly, to give it the appearance of official sanction, he also requested a detachment of Roman soldiers from the cohort stationed in the Antonia fortress, the military barracks that overlooked the temple from the northwest corner. The Gospel of John specifically mentions that a cohort was part of the arresting party, which would have been a unit of 600 men, though it is likely that only a portion of the cohort was actually sent. Still, the presence of Roman soldiers tells us something important. The Romans were already involved. They were not in the dark about what was happening. Pilate or his officers had been informed and had agreed to cooperate with the arrest. As midnight passed and moved toward the darkest hours before dawn, word finally came. Judas had led the contingent to a garden called Gethsemane, on the slope of the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley from the city. Jesus and his disciples had gone there after their Passover meal. It was a place Jesus often visited, a quiet grove of ancient olive trees where one could pray undisturbed. Judas knew it well, and in that garden, by the light of torches and lanterns, the betrayal happened exactly as planned. Judas approached Jesus and greeted him with a kiss, the prearranged signal to identify which man in the group should be arrested. The disciples, realizing what was happening, tried to resist. Peter drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. But Jesus stopped the violence, healed the man's ear according to Luke's account, and surrendered himself voluntarily. He spoke to the crowd with words that revealed he understood the moment completely. "Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns." And so Jesus was bound and led away, while his disciples scattered in fear, just as he had predicted they would. The arresting party marched him back across the Kidron Valley, through one of the city gates, and up through the dark streets to the upper city and the house of Caiaphas. But interestingly, the Gospel of John tells us that they brought Jesus first to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas and the former high priest. This detail is significant. Annas had been removed from the office of high priest by the Romans years before, but he remained the power behind the throne, the patriarch of the high priestly family, and a man whose opinion still carried enormous weight. By bringing Jesus to Annas first, the arresting party was acknowledging the real structure of power. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered that he had spoken openly in synagogues and at the temple, that he had said nothing in secret, and that Annas should ask those who had heard him teach if he wanted to know what Jesus had said. One of the officials struck Jesus in the face for this answer, considering it disrespectful to the former high priest. But Jesus stood his ground. "If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" After this preliminary questioning, Annas sent Jesus, still bound, to Caiaphas. And now the real proceeding began, the gathering that the Gospel writers describe in detail, the confrontation between Jesus and the assembled council in the house of the high priest. It was still night, probably between 1 and 3 in the morning. The members of the council who had been waiting were now assembled in the upper room. Jesus was brought before them, and Caiaphas, presiding over this illegal nighttime session, began to seek testimony that would justify a death sentence. The problem was that the testimony did not hold together. The Gospel of Mark tells us that many testified falsely against Jesus, but their statements did not agree. This was crucial under Jewish law. The Torah required that any capital charge be established by the testimony of at least 2 witnesses who agreed on the facts. If the witnesses contradicted each other, the testimony was invalid. Some witnesses came forward and said, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands.'" But even on this charge, their testimony did not agree. They were probably referring to something Jesus had said years before at the beginning of his ministry, recorded in John chapter 2, when he spoke of destroying the temple and raising it in 3 days. John explains that Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body, about his death and resurrection, but those who heard him could have understood it as a threat against the physical temple building. And any threat against the temple was serious business. It was the center of the nation's life. But the witnesses could not get their story straight. They contradicted each other on details, and so the charge fell apart. Caiaphas was frustrated. This was taking too long. Dawn was approaching. They needed to move to Pilate soon if they wanted to have Jesus executed before the Sabbath. So Caiaphas decided to question Jesus directly. The high priest stood up before them all and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. He offered no defense. He did not engage with the charges. This silence was itself profound. Isaiah had prophesied about the suffering servant. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus was fulfilling prophecy in his very refusal to speak. But Caiaphas was not interested in prophecy. He was interested in getting a conviction, and so he changed his approach. He put Jesus under oath and asked him the direct question that would force a response. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." This was the moment everything had been building toward. This was the question that cut through all the legal maneuvering and false testimony and got to the heart of the matter. Who are you? Are you the Christ? Are you claiming to be the Son of God? Because if you are, that is blasphemy, and blasphemy is punishable by death. And Jesus, who had been silent up to this point, now spoke. The accounts in the different Gospels vary slightly in wording, but the substance is the same. Matthew records Jesus saying, "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Mark records it as, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Luke adds that Jesus said, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They then asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." What Jesus said in that moment was not ambiguous. He was claiming to be the Messiah. He was claiming to be the Son of Man, a title from the book of Daniel that referred to a divine figure who would come on the clouds of heaven and receive eternal dominion. He was claiming that he would sit at the right hand of God, a position of ultimate authority and equality with God himself. And he was claiming that his judges would see him in that position, that the tables would be turned, that the ones condemning him now would one day stand before him as judge. For the high priest and the council, this was all they needed. This was the confession they had been looking for. Caiaphas responded with a dramatic gesture. He tore his clothes, ripping the fabric of his robe in a traditional sign of horror and grief at hearing blasphemy. He said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered, "He is worthy of death." In that moment, in the house of Caiaphas, in the early hours of Friday morning, the religious leaders of Israel condemned to death the very Messiah they claimed to be waiting for. They condemned him for telling the truth about who he was. They condemned him because he threatened their power, their position, their arrangement with Rome, and their understanding of how God should work in the world. But the condemnation was not the end of the indignity. What happened next reveals the cruelty and contempt that the council felt toward Jesus. The Gospels tell us that they spit in his face. They struck him with their fists. They blindfolded him and hit him and mocked him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Messiah." "Who hit you?" The guards took him and beat him. This was the treatment given to the one whom Christians would later worship as Lord and Saviour, as the Word made flesh, as the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. In the house of the high priest, in the presence of the religious authorities, the Son of God was beaten and mocked and abused, and he endured it. He did not call down angels to rescue him. He did not strike his tormentors with divine judgment. He absorbed the violence and the hatred because this was why he had come. This was the cup he had prayed about in Gethsemane, the cup of suffering that he had asked might be taken from him, but which he chose to drink because it was the Father's will. While all of this was happening in the upper room and the courtyards of Caiaphas' house, another drama was unfolding outside, a drama that would forever mark one of Jesus' closest disciples. Peter had followed the arresting party at a distance. He had not fled like the others. He wanted to know what would happen to Jesus, and so he made his way to the house of Caiaphas and gained entrance to the courtyard, probably through the help of another disciple who knew the high priest's household. It was cold that night, and the servants and guards had lit a fire in the courtyard to warm themselves. Peter joined them, trying to blend in, trying to remain anonymous. But he was noticed. A servant girl looked at him carefully and said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Peter denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. He moved toward the gate, trying to leave, but another girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again Peter denied it, this time with an oath. "I don't know the man." A little later, others came up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Peter was from Galilee, and his speech patterns were recognizable to the Judeans. And now Peter began to call down curses, to swear with the strongest language possible. "I don't know the man." And at that moment, the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him just hours before, during the Passover meal. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter, the bold disciple who had drawn a sword in the garden, who had walked on water, who had confessed Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, went outside and wept bitterly. His denials had taken place in the very house where Jesus was being condemned. Possibly at the very moment Peter was denying knowing Jesus, Jesus was in the room above, claiming to be the Son of God. The contrast is devastating. One man was confessing the truth at the cost of his life. The other was denying the truth to save his skin. As dawn broke over Jerusalem on Friday morning, the council knew they had to move to the next phase. The nighttime session in Caiaphas' house had accomplished its purpose. They had their confession. They had their charge of blasphemy. But now they needed to make it official. Jewish law did not allow for trials at night, and certainly not during a festival. So at daybreak, as the city began to stir and the early morning sacrifices began at the temple, the Sanhedrin convened in a more formal session, probably in their usual meeting place near the temple. This was not a new trial. It was a ratification of what had already been decided. They asked Jesus the same question: "Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus gave essentially the same answer. Luke records him saying, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They said, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." And they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." The religious trial was over. Jesus had been condemned for blasphemy by the highest religious authority in Israel. But as we have already noted, they could not execute him. For that they needed Pilate. And so they bound Jesus and led him away to the praetorium, the governor's residence, to demand that Rome do what they could not. But that is the next chapter of the story. Our focus has been on what happened in the house of Caiaphas on that Thursday night turning into Friday morning, and what we have witnessed is one of the great ironies and tragedies of human history. The religious leaders of God's chosen people, the ones who studied the scriptures and knew the prophecies and offered sacrifices in the temple, condemned the very Messiah those scriptures promised. They did it in the name of protecting the nation. They did it to preserve the temple and maintain peace with Rome. But in doing so, they fulfilled the very prophecies they claimed to believe. The house of Caiaphas that night was more than just the scene of an illegal trial. It was the collision point of 2 kingdoms. The kingdom of this world, represented by Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, and their careful political calculations, and their alliance with Roman power, met the kingdom of God, represented by Jesus, who stood bound and beaten before them, but who spoke with an authority that no earthly power could match. The kingdom of this world operates by force and fear and the preservation of self-interest. The kingdom of God operates by truth and sacrifice and the laying down of one's life for others. And on that night, the kingdom of this world appeared to win. They arrested the king. They convicted him in their court. They would hand him over to be executed. But the deeper truth, which would become clear in just 3 days, was that the kingdom of God was accomplishing its victory precisely through that apparent defeat. Everything that happened in the house of Caiaphas that Thursday night had been prophesied centuries before. Isaiah had written about the suffering servant who would be despised and rejected by men, who would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, who would be assigned a grave with the wicked, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. The psalmist had written, "The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed." Zechariah had prophesied that they would weigh out 30 pieces of silver as his price. And Jesus himself had told his disciples repeatedly that he would be betrayed, arrested, tried, condemned, and killed, and that on the third day he would rise again. None of what happened that night was outside of God's plan. In fact, it was the very center of God's plan. The cross that loomed just hours ahead was not plan B. It was not God's response to human failure. It was the plan from the foundation of the world, the way that God would reconcile humanity to himself, the way that justice and mercy would meet, the way that sin would be punished and sinners would be saved. Caiaphas thought he was protecting the nation by eliminating a troublemaker. He did not know that he was participating in the one event that would offer salvation to every nation on earth. He thought he was preserving the temple by stopping a man who spoke against it. He did not know that within a generation that temple would be destroyed by Rome anyway, and that the presence of God would no longer dwell in a building made with hands, but in the hearts of all who believed in Jesus. He thought he was maintaining peace with Rome by removing a potential rebel. He did not know that he was making peace between God and humanity, possible through the blood of the cross. Caiaphas spoke more truly than he knew when he said it was better for one man to die for the people. That was not just political expediency, it was the gospel. As the sun rose over Jerusalem that Friday morning and the council led Jesus away to Pilate, the house of Caiaphas returned to silence. The lamps were extinguished. The council members dispersed. The courtyard where Peter had denied Jesus was swept clean. The upper room where the trial had taken place was emptied. The servants went about their normal duties, and the high priest, having accomplished what he set out to do, prepared for the continuation of the Passover feast, unaware that he had just presided over the judgment of the true Passover lamb, the one whose blood would mark the doorposts of human hearts, and whose death would mean that the angel of death would pass over all who believed. The events of that night in the house of Caiaphas reveal something profound about the human heart and about the nature of spiritual blindness. These were not ignorant men. They were educated, religious, dedicated to the study of Scripture, and yet they missed the Messiah standing in front of them. They missed him because they were looking for a different kind of Messiah, one who would fit their expectations, one who would work within their system, one who would overthrow Rome and restore Israel's political independence. They were not looking for a Messiah who would die for sins. They were not looking for a Messiah who would claim equality with God. They were not looking for a Messiah who would challenge their authority and their interpretation of the law. And so when that Messiah came, they rejected him. They called his truth blasphemy. They called his miracles the work of demons. They called his message dangerous, and they killed him. This is the warning that echoes from that Thursday night, down through the centuries, to every generation of religious people. It is possible to be deeply religious and completely wrong. It is possible to know the Scriptures and miss the Savior. It is possible to be so committed to preserving the institution that you reject the very person the institution exists to point toward. Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin were convinced they were serving God. They believed they were protecting God's people and God's temple. But in reality, they were opposing God's plan and rejecting God's Son. The house of Caiaphas that night was full of religious authority and empty of spiritual truth. It was full of legal procedure and empty of justice. It was full of political calculation and empty of love. But there is another way to look at that night. From the perspective of Christian theology, everything that happened in the house of Caiaphas was necessary. Not just permitted by God, but required by God's plan of salvation. Without the betrayal, without the arrest, without the trial, without the condemnation, there would be no cross. And without the cross, there would be no atonement for sin, no reconciliation with God, no resurrection, no victory over death, no salvation. The question that believers have wrestled with for 2,000 years is how to hold together the fact that what Caiaphas and Judas and the Sanhedrin did was genuinely evil and genuinely their choice, for which they were genuinely responsible, and at the same time it was part of God's predetermined plan. Peter addressed this directly in his sermon on the day of Pentecost, recorded in Acts chapter 2, when he said, "This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." Both things are true. It was God's plan, and it was human wickedness. The sovereignty of God and the responsibility of humanity are both real. The house of Caiaphas on that Thursday night was the stage where this mystery was acted out. It was the place where human hatred and divine love intersected, where human injustice became the means of divine justice, where human rejection accomplished divine acceptance, where the worst thing ever done, the murder of the Son of God, became the best thing ever done, the salvation of the world. Every mockery, every blow, every false accusation, every illegal procedure, every act of cruelty in that house was a sin. And every bit of it was part of the pathway to redemption. This is the scandal and the glory of the cross. God does not just overcome evil, He uses evil. He takes the worst that humanity can do and transforms it into the greatest good. He takes the most unjust verdict ever rendered and makes it the basis for justifying the ungodly. He takes the death of the innocent and makes it the means of life for the guilty. As we reflect on what happened in the house of Caiaphas on that Thursday night, we are confronted with questions about ourselves. Where would we have been that night? Would we have been in the upper room with Caiaphas, protecting our interests and our position? Would we have been in the courtyard with Peter, denying any connection to Jesus to save ourselves? Would we have been in the garden with Judas, betraying the one we claim to follow? Or would we have been with the disciples who fled in fear? The truth is, we are all there. We all have something of Caiaphas in us, the religious self-righteousness that opposes God while claiming to serve Him. We all have something of Peter in us, the weakness that denies Christ when confession is costly. We all have something of Judas in us, the capacity to betray for our own advantage. And we all have something of the fleeing disciples in us, the fear that makes